it's time to start. We're a little sparse, but I think it's time to begin the meeting. I want to always start at 10:30, and I've got 10:31. So we will, first of all, welcome all of you here to our December 6th meeting of the Álamos History Association. And we're meeting on Beethoven's birthday. I just thought I'd bring that out. So listen to Ode to Joy sometime today and get in the spirit. But to welcome us, our president, Pam Price, will give us a word of welcome.
Okay. Well, it's hard to get information about the lives of women in the history of Álamos. We can probably assume that the Spanish descent upper class women played a role in maintaining the highly exclusionary social life of the elites of the town. But individuals don't stand out much.
Unless they were mistresses.
I suddenly lost my
No, you're on. We're here.
I said unless they were mistresses. Or died.
Ureya's little book about her youthful years is a treasure in this respect, which we will hear about from Errol. There you go, Errol.
Oh, thank you so much. And Ellen said, we never heard about the women unless they got in trouble. And those kinds of women we heard about. And also, Pam, thanks for mentioning that we're dealing with the elite. And that's what Otilia Urrea de Figueroa was. Now, I'm going to go to screen share. Okay, that only took 15 minutes of your time and mine, and I apologize profusely. But we're a small group, and there's, I guess we have to accept these little glitches, but I should have tried it out ahead of time. Welcome, and we will start, and I'll move right into it. This booklet, the copyright had expired, and so I was able to scan it and put it online. And I know that many of you have thumbed through it and read it before, but there's always new things in there to enjoy. I wanted to first tell about some of the things that she wrote about Álamos at this time. She was born in 1903, and she left Álamos in 1918. So she was writing about her childhood up until she was, 14, 15 years old, and her perceptions. It's not a history book. What I would like, I'm going to turn this around a little bit here. I wish that we had a book which she gave names and dates and her family tree, and that's not what we have in this book. She just gives her the things that related to her and that she remembers. But here's some things that we have about Álamos during the 19th century. It says the houses in the center of town were inhabited by wealthy people that had over $200,000 to $400,000 in gold and silver. And we all know about the wealth of Álamos. And it had the provisions are scarce because, of course, they couldn't grow crops other than maybe a few crops for their own, their own consumption, subsistence. And a lot of the grain, the corn and the wheat, came from Urey, which is a long way away. So the water was bad and scarce, and that hasn't changed too much, although I think the water's okay, but it is, of course, scarce. She says the inhabitants are proud and unsociable. This was from a pamphlet about Álamos, so it's not her, Otilia, saying it, but proud and unsociable and have no amusements other than gambling. Well, the unsociable part, we'll pick up on that just a little later, mentions the church and has the population of 6,000 with 3,000 to 4,000 more employed in the mines. And I know that we've all heard numbers. We've heard that Alamos once had 30,000 people. I have told that. I have read it in different places. There's a lot of it is just guesswork. You know, maybe in the municipio, but a lot of it is, I don't think there were ever 30,000 people living in this area that we now call Alamos. But at this time, it was about 6,000. There's an article in a Spanish newspaper that she quotes saying how gifted the people were, very knowledgeable about art and music. And this performer, and this was Adolfo Wilhelmi, and he in his performance, he looked out and peeked through the curtain and saw the crowd gathering, and here were ladies with gloves up over their hands, over their elbows, men dressed in the latest of style. And he says, a public of jeweled ladies, you know, and gentlemen dressed correctly. And in our first season, we presented Traviata, Carmen, et cetera, et cetera. And he said it was just one of the best audiences he'd ever seen. So the people of Alamos at that time in the upper level were well educated, were, you know, had the correct manners and had the correct appearance, you know, on par with in Europe. I wanted to show a few pictures of Alamos at the time period that we're talking about. This was at the dedication of the kiosk in the center, the Plaza de Armas. And the picture was taken from on top of the church, and looking down, you can see there were people there, probably the dignitaries that were set up right by the kiosk, and then other people over to the sides. I notice also the benches at that point faced in. Of course, the plaza has changed much in 100 and some years. This picture was on the cover of Juan Carlos Olguin's recent book on the Porfiriata. And we don't know, I asked Juan Carlos to give me more information on it. I've not received any, but we do know that the picture was taken after 1895 because we can see City Hall back there. And it was a celebration, there were no cars around. I'm wondering if it wasn't the welcoming in of 1900, the 20th century, I'm not sure. It could have been connected with the centennial of independence, but I think in 1910, it looks like it was taken before that. But anyway, there is Alamos in the street. Now, this is 1906. And again, we've got the benches facing to the inside, and I'm sure they're facing outside now, but they were in a different location. And whenever I see these pictures, I wonder, did they lower the street or did they raise up the plaza? Because they were on the same level in all of these early pictures. And some of you may know that, but I've never really asked that question, but I wonder. We have 3 pictures that were taken in 1910. They're on our website, and they're just floating around with pictures of Alamos. This is one of them. It looks rather primitive, but this was Alamos at the time that Otilia Urrea de Figueroa was writing. This is from the 7 Pillars, looking down Juarez Street toward the plaza. We've got the top of City Hall at the left, and maybe the church there on the right. And this shows the bishop's house, now with Craig and Sandra Fisher, and also dated 1910. To the right are the ruins of the governor's palace. A First Communion, this picture Juan Carlos put on his Facebook page, and I put it out. I have no idea why so many kids at one time, other than it might have been over several different months or whatever, the communion. Now, a little bit about Otilia Urrea de Figueroa. And we have First of all, that her mother was Seda da Salido de Urey. And so her mother was a Salido, and the Salido family home, her mother's home, was there where the terracotta restaurant in that area is now. At that time, that was the Salido family home, right next to what is the Portales Hotel now, which is, all of this was once Jose Maria Almada, but at this time the Salidos had the center part. And in that home that her mother grew up in, it said there were 3 unmarried Salido sisters. And she describes them. The oldest one, Maclovia, ran everything and was in charge. The second daughter was kind of inspected the birds. And then her favorite was Antonieta, who kept all of the plants to keep everyone in good health. And so those were the 3 sisters. Now they also lived with their bachelor brother and Hermenegildo, that's quite a name, but they called him Hildo, who was a gentleman. And he played the piano at 11 o'clock each day, and then he rode out to the ranch at La Esmeralda. And we know that's out towards the airport out there. That was a ranch at that time. And he wore a charro suit when he went out there. Now, she mentions her grandmother, who she loved, and her grandmother had 35. Now, this was her grandmother on the Urey side, but had 35 grandchildren. And she just gave them hugs and treats whenever they came. And her house was directly across from the old Tesoros. It's on Gutierrez and Obregon streets. And it's just down the street from the bishop's house. And we walked past it many times. And that was her grandmother's house at that time. And when her grandmother died, then the house went to her aunt, Rafaelita, whose husband had passed away early. And her aunt and grandmother lived together for many years. And then the house went to her aunt upon her mother's death. We have the pictures anyway of Senora Salida de Urey and Miguel Urey. Now, I didn't mention Miguel, but of course, Miguel, I don't have that. She didn't write that much of his family, but he ran the distillery at La Colorado. And there was an orchard there and the distillery. And of course, La Colorado is still there. And he also had a cattle ranch. And I think I'll go back one if I can. Whoops, no, here. Anyway, he had a cattle ranch, Carizal, and then they also had a property at what is now the Parque La Colorado up there in the mountains. So this was a family that was well connected and a family of wealth. She talks about her parents, but not, again, the things that you would normally see. She mentions her impression of her mother, and her mother told a story in the second paragraph about how that a diamond which falls in the mud will still be a diamond, but a copper coin that falls into the mud will tarnish. And she used that in an occasion with one of her sisters was unkind to someone in the community. I'm struggling with getting the connection there. It may be clear when you look through the book, you may see that. Her father, the incident she talks about her father, of course, is quite clear. Her oldest son, her oldest brother, Miguel, Martin was in charge of the ranch. And Martin went to his father and had a great idea on how to put a dam. Now, his father, after Martin had left, his father told another son, he says, well, it will be a mistake. And the son said, well, why didn't you tell that to Martin? And he said, I would rather have him make a mistake than to take away his initiative. And I think that's a wonderful lesson, really, because we're often trying to tell people, oh, it won't work. And what we should do is let people, let them keep their initiative, let them try, because maybe it will work. Now, when we have about people were kind of unsociable, she writes in there, I've got this little snippet, Alamos did not have the Joneses to keep up with. Without any merit on the part of the Alamenses, their social status was established by their ancestors, and they did not strive to impress anyone. And I thought that was interesting, but it goes back to what Pam said at the beginning. There was that wealthy class. Now, this was a picture she had of the Boers girl, one of the Boers sisters, and this was Maria Boers. And I thought this was kind of a very clever story, but she said she was 8 or 9 years old and she was invited to be with the 3 sisters. And of course, the Boers family, the Salido family was close. And she said they always, the rest of her life, she was friendly with those three girls that lived on the corner in what is now the Boers Center. And they called her, their Amiguita. And she mentions that one afternoon they called and said, can Otilia come to our house at 4 o'clock? And they sent, so she was sent with the maid from her household over to the Boers house, and her mother's words were, be a little lady and don't talk too much. And she said her mother often worried that she would be talking too much. A little bit about La Colorado. And this property, when Otilia Figueroa came back to Álamos in 1990, and she was interviewed by Bev Kruchek at that time. And when she came back, she stayed in the Tesoros Hotel. And at that time, the Baron owned the Mansion, the former Hotel Mansion was their family home, the Urey de Figueroa home. And at that time, it was owned by the Baron. I don't know, some of you remember well, the Baron, this was before Carol and I were a part of Álamos, but he was quite a character, and he had that home which later Janet bought and became the Colonial. Well, anyway, the orchard and distillery, he walked from that home every day, and sometimes she would walk with him up to La Colorado. And she enjoyed it very much. She loved the orchard and the distillery. And where the house is now was, south, she said, of the house was, the distillery was south of the house. I mentioned that in 1990, Otilia came back to Álamos. And at that time, the Haywoods owned that property, Mr. and Ms. Albert Haywood. And that, after they passed away, that property went to their daughter, Judy, who was married to Dean Jacoby. And for many years, they had the property. They are now gone, but I think the property still remains in the family. I talked with Stephanie a couple of days ago. By the way, Stephanie had her cataract surgery a couple of days ago, and it was great, and she's seeing good, she said. But she didn't know who, if any, in the family were keeping up the property or anything, but it still belonged to that family. Now, she mentions one of her memories was about the chief steward of the distillery that her father had hired, and he was a leader in the Mayo community and had special functions to perform a Day of the Dead. And she mentions that the cemetery had a special Indian portion, which I thought was interesting. When we now have an intern looking up information on the cemetery of different parts, aspects, but that would be something good. A segregated, at one time the Pantheon was segregated, and I wasn't aware of that. But on the Indian graves, it said there were baskets of tamales that people would stop and pray, and then they could take a tamale and eat. Now, when on most Sundays, her father liked to go, and he took family with him, to their property up in the mountains, and they would leave after the 4 o'clock mass. Now, I can't imagine a priest getting excited about a 4 a.m. mass, but they would leave after the mass, and she had horses were delivered. I don't know from the ranch or from La Colorado, but the horses they would ride would be delivered to their house here in Álamos, and they would take off, before daylight to go up the path. And there's a picture I think you've all seen of people going on a path up into the mountains there. And that was an important, part of her childhood. She gives about, I put there, I thought was an if I were a rich man, but I put if I were a rich wife. But it was her mother's life. And this, she said the mornings were busy because she had to take care of the servants and make sure they stayed on task. And of course, she had to teach them exactly what to do and do it in the right way. And they had servants, a number of them, she doesn't say. But each morning, her mother would plan the meals with the cook. And then the mozo would do the shopping. And these were little boys that would go around and go over town, run errands, deliver messages. And he would do the shopping and go down. And of course, it was all the shopkeepers kept a ledger with their name on it. And they would pay every so often. So sometimes the Indians would bring in eggs from the ranches to help with their supplies. And of course, cooking was done with a wood stove. And we've seen pictures of the burros coming into town with the wood. She said that most housewives preferred Brazil wood to mesquite. Now the household, they had a servant for washing, another for ironing, dusting and cleaning the house. All of them had to be managed by Otilia's mother, Celida. And now at 11 o'clock, she said the women of the town would call on friends, but at 12 o'clock, or friends or family. So it was a brief visit. At 12 o'clock, they were back home because the children came home from school, and the husbands often came home from work, and they had a big afternoon meal together. And of course, that's still common in many Mexican homes. And then at 2 o'clock, the kids returned to school and came back at 5. So from 2 to 5, the wife, her mother, was rather free and took her leisurely bath. And then at 5, she was ready to hear from her kids what all happened, and from her husband, and etc. The noon meals were large. The evening meals were large for the people in this class of Álamos. And after the evening meal, her mother, Celida, and her father, Miguel, would often go visit, what often arranged, but they would dress formally and visit other families of the evening and go calling together. So that was anyway the day of the housewife. This is a picture, and by the way, to the left, this was the home of her grandmother that she talks about. And because this is Gutierrez Street looking north, and that's the ruins of the governor's mansion there in the background. This picture was taken a little bit later than the time period that we're talking about. Now, she gives a number of recipes, and I'm not interested in recipes, but you can find some good ones. I put this in because I thought this would be so much work to make jelly, but she calls it Mexican lime conserve. And, you had 200 green limes every day on our lime tree. When we were there here last month, it seemed like every day we got 30 or 40 limes. But anyway, 200 green limes. You mix that 2.5 to 3 kilos of granulated sugar. That looks good. 2 small handfuls of wood ashes. Doesn't sound appetizing to me, and then 4 tablespoons of salt. And it took 3 days. And she tells what to do on the first day, the second day, and then the third day. And then on the third day, you cooked until it reached kind of a jelly stage. And I thought, my, how much work it would be to just make some jelly or jam. But of course, this was done not by the housewife, but by people in the house. She mentions a little about saint days, which I was not aware of until I read her book. And she has that if a girl had boyfriends, if she was lucky enough, and the first, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but first you had the Pretendientes. And these were just kind of if you were a young lady, a male acquaintance. And if they wanted to, be more than a pretendiente, they would serenade the girl on her feast day. And of course, any girl named Guadalupe, that was December 12th. That was her feast day. And so they would hire a band and they would go to her house and they would serenade her. I've got my dog here. Maybe Carolyn can come in and open the door and let the dog out. So anyway, that was, now her feast day was on the 13th of December. And she says one time she was lucky enough to have 3 serenades at that time on her feast day. And these serenades, Joe Curry's interview, he talks about the serenades, and he mentions something I never thought about. They had to be at midnight, and the lady being serenaded, or the girl serenaded, could not acknowledge that the music was being played. She stayed in a room, the lights were off. She didn't come on in the movies, of course. She comes onto the balcony and drops a flower. That did not happen in Álamos. They were serenaded. They had to stay in the room and not even acknowledge that it was going on. But of course, they were quite aware of it. But you would hire a band, and like Joe Curry said, it was dark at midnight. He says you can't imagine how dark that town was at midnight, because Joe serenaded his wife when he got married in the 1950s. So you think about that, people going across town, hiring musicians to serenade the young girls on their feast days. And they weren't even her boyfriends. They were kind of, or they were want to be, they wanted let's say, a deeper relationship. Anyway, the customs, I'll talk a little more about that later. She has about the customs of mourning and how that the women, had more rigid rules than the men had. And so every lady in the household had to dress in severe black for the first 9 days. And, when friends came, the ladies covered their heads with long black shawls. And we've seen pictures of that, of the people with the black shawls and dressing in white. This was the first 9 days. Bows were hung over the doors. And she mentioned that this mourning period went on for a year if parents had passed away. And it was 6 months for brothers or sisters and grandparents. Aunts, uncles and cousins were 3 months. And it says for the last ones, black and white was accepted. But for a lot of widows, they dressed in black the rest of their lives. It's hard to imagine that in today's day and age. But she mentions that, on the other hand, the last sentence down there, men went about their business as usual, enjoying their machismo with a black band sewed on the left sleeve of their jackets. So they went ahead. They didn't have to do anything special other than to have the black band. And these were very strictly followed anyway. I'm going to come back to this. Okay. Now, because I'm going to take this slide there at the end, toward the end. Now, the La Sierra, this was the picture I mentioned about people going up the mountain, 30 or 40, they're going by muleback or walking. And this was to the area which is now in the Parque La Colorado. And she mentions they first went through the mescalera, the plantation to where they grew the mezcal that was for the distillery. And then they went on, she describes the plants and the trees. And she mentioned it was a place that all of the family went. And often her aunt, Rafaelita, was kind of the chaperone to keep the people together. And it was just a wonderful time. And she loved it if they had rain and they could be there in the mountains when the rain was coming down. And I can understand that. I love to be on our back patio when the rain is coming down. And so the streams would come and there'd be waterfalls, and another picture of a little irrigation area that was up in the mountains. But they would go there. Her father would go just about every Sunday, and often joined by her, Otilia, and her cousins and other members of the family. Now let's go back to the serenades, and we have Otilia describes her sister's courtship, and I put these in numbers because this was kind of a 8-step process anyway. First, the first thing was that her husband-to-be, Pancho La Madrid, asked her sister Luz to dance at the Club Alamense. Now, the Club Alamense was on the north side of the Plaza de Armas, in the middle, right next to the Robles House at Kissing Alley, and of course the old Las Palmeras restaurant. It's now Andrew McGahee's establishment on the right. Right in the middle was the Club Alamense. And she calls it, in one place, she calls it a bastion of masculinity. The men would go there. It was kind of like a men's club, but they would have community gatherings there. So he first asked Luz to dance. Well, that was step number one. And he then became a pretendiente. And he was able to visit the house because he was pretendiente to call on her. And he also he walked with her on the plaza. We've all heard the stories that the men would walk one way on the plaza, or the girls and the boys, teenagers, the boys would walk one way on the plaza, the girls would walk the opposite way. And that way they could exchange greetings as they went along and kind of check each other's out. But he was able to walk with her, her future husband, because he was a pretendiente. So he had moved up one step in this process. Now, I think it's interesting. I've heard that different people talked about it. Ida, Louisa Franklin talks about it when she came to Alamos in the 50s, that it went on. I know Hector Valenzuela, when I interviewed him, he said when he got there in the 70s, he said nothing like that ever happened. So I'm not sure at what point it went out of favor. Now, it said then Pancho serenaded her, playing her favorite songs. See, they had to know what songs the girl wanted to hear or type of music, and they would hire the musicians to play for them. Just 3 or 4 people were playing. And then at some point, he told Luz that he loved her. And after declaring his love, he was able to accompany her home from church services and other special events. But this was after he said, okay, I love you. Now, at that point, after he said that, then his mother was a widow. So Pancho's mother visited, and aunt, his mother and aunt visited the Urey household, and they asked in official, it was almost scripted, they asked for the hand of the beautiful, virtuous Luz to be, it was like they followed a script. And so that was when the family officially asked permission. Now we're down to number 6. And after that, the visits were twice a week, but they still had to have a chaperone. And Otilia says she was a chaperone sometimes, and it was very boring, but they couldn't be left alone. Who knows what would happen. And then a tentative date was set for the wedding, and the La Madrid family then sent her 2 wedding gowns, one for the civil ceremony, one for the religious ceremony. And of course, I think still marriages today have the 2 ceremonies. You need to have a religious ceremony and a civil ceremony. And I know when a good friend of ours Jesus Soto got married in Hermosillo. This has been over 20 years ago now. They just celebrated an anniversary. But when they got married, they had the religious ceremony. Then the judge was supposed to arrive at the reception to perform the civil ceremony. And for whatever reason, he never showed up. Well, the reception went on till 3 or 4 in the morning, but I told Jesus, the marriage cannot be consummated until there is the civil portion. And he didn't seem to agree with that. Anyway, they went to their honeymoon without the civil and then got that done later. So anyway, there were 2 wedding dresses which were sewn by a seamstress in Los Angeles for this wedding. And so then invitations were sent out. There was the wedding, and then a nuptial mass followed the wedding. And then they went home to their new house on Aurora Street, which is now Madero Street. And exactly 9 months later, their first child was born, which Otilia writes, saving her honor. It was kind of a joke there. Now, she mentions the telephone system that was at the time, which were the mozos. And I remember, if you look over our interviews on the webpage, different people talk about how that before Álamos had a phone system, you would hire little boys to take a message just to get together for coffee or tea or to have drinks at 5 or something. They would have a boy deliver a message to the house of another foreigner and say, hey, drop by. Well, the mozos did all of that work. And any communication, if someone was sick, and she had the knocking at the zaguán, which she describes as the front door, could also be a hallway there. But he would stand with his hat in hand and deliver a message. He had a little speech to give, and he might want to know how the person was feeling, if they'd been sick. And of course, the typical response was, oh, they're doing much better now. And he would be happy and then give anyway his message. And if they weren't better, he would be sent the next day to find out how they did during the night. She mentioned that their servant, they had a family servant, she said Teodoro, and he was well dressed. He even wore shoes. Most of the mozos just wore huaraches, but he wore shoes. And he, he was associated with the family, that if anyone saw him, they knew, hey, he was the mozo for the, Salido family. And many families had the mozo. The street vendors, now that picture is taken there at the bishop's house on the corner. And it was also taken at the time she was writing about this, as we have the date as 1907. And the vendors would come to their doors and they would call out. It's kind of like how the motorcycles come around now. But they would call out with the products they had for sale. Often you didn't know when they were coming or what they would have. And it was kind of nice. Now, she mentioned she liked a bread, a flat round bread, which she called semitas calientes. So, and it was had brown sugar and on it, and sounds delicious anyway. And then they had the different calientes de cabeza, the pumpkin turnovers. There was a blind man that would sell tamales, I think she has there, or pork tamales. And he would come and stand outside there, and you would recognize, and you'd make the exchange. And sometimes the Indians would come in with fish straight from the Cuchujaqui River. And you never knew if they were coming, but they were always greatly appreciated. Now, I'm going to go back just a little bit to what I'd skipped over. Leaving Álamos during the revolution. Now, we know the tentative dates. The revolution really began in 1910. And we know that Díaz resigned his presidency at that time. Madero took over, and that led to 11 years of turmoil within the country. And we've all studied that at different times. But for the wealthy of Álamos, it was a very sad time. And for her family, the Urey de Figueroas, she mentions that, well, first, she said during the revolution, 1917, Elias Plutarco Calles was elected governor of Sonora. Now, he later became president of the country, but he was elected governor and he declared the state dry. Well, of course, the distillery and the mezcal, that was the livelihood of the family, and they'd become wealthy with it. No longer could they sell the product, and the plantations that gave the mezcal, they were all closed. So anyway, that was part of the the suffering of the family. And it had their mountain property was confiscated. Their cattle ranch was vandalized, she writes. And she says, and the direct quote, those years from 1912 to 1918, when I left Álamos, were spent in an atmosphere of mute mourning, as if waiting for the next blow to fall. Now, she gives a story about her oldest brother that went to the United States during that time. And he went there to stay with an aunt, and he left, and all of them left. She left, of course, too, but he left before, and he got to Nogales to withdraw money for his trip, and the bank had closed, so there was no money. And he stayed with his sister in Los Angeles, and he eventually had to work at very humbling jobs. And of course, this was someone who had lived in wealth, and now he had to work, as whether it was, whatever in labor, typical labor. And he mentions that, or she mentions at some point that her mother said, don't worry about what job you take, because your ability will shine through and you will rise to the top. And her brother did. He was eventually hired by a shoe firm in St. Louis, and he was sent to Mexico City to manage the property, and lived in Mexico City, and was wealthy enough to send his children to the United States for their education. So in his case, at least, it did turn out. But it was a time of great suffering for this family and for all the other families that were of wealth. I'm going to skip now now this map is in our guidebook, and the map that she gives, we're going to talk a little bit about the walking map, not too much, but we'll talk a little bit about it. This was the map that she has, which is on the back portion of her book. And I was going to use my mouse to point out some things, but she begins with the Palacio. And maybe if I plug in here, I had to switch computers and do all of this, and now I have to plug in my mouse so that I can do what I wanted. There we go. Okay, now she starts with the Palacio there, and she doesn't, our guidebook, and thanks to Pam and to Leila first, who that researched information on the houses, she really doesn't do that. She just gives her memory of this and that about town, but she starts with the Palacio, which of course was done in the 1890s when Ramon Corral was the governor. The governor of Sonora. Whoops, we skipped. Whoops, skipped ahead back. Let's see here. Okay, let me go back. Okay, back to the map. So anyway, she begins at the Palacio, which was
said no internet, so
very, very new at that time. She has 3 houses marked 3, 4, and 5. She said 2 of them belonged to the Almadas, or they were the homes of Almadas at that time. Now, this whole area, of course, is the Jose Maria Almada house, but in number 7, that was a Salido family home at that time. Now, up here, we have the Boers Center, but that on the map anyway, the portion that I have here, that's not there. Where the Portales Hotel is, was of course an Almada home, but also she mentioned here, let's move one up. She has the two members that it says the Plum next to the Portales. The corner property belonged to the Palomares family at that time. So, and that she's talking about number here, the property right there on the corner of Madero Street. And of course, the plaza there, this was the Palomares family. Now, if we go up to the north side, she mentions 3 different properties. What we now call the Robles property, the Robles House, was the La Madrid, Gomez La Madrid house. In the center was the Club Alamense, but this club was owned by 2 Salido sisters. They rented out for the Club Alamense. So the property was owned by Salidos. Now over to the right, let's skip down. I don't want to make a mistake. It says at the end of the block, where McGahee's restaurant, whatever is today, it was the home of Alberto Almada. Now, before that, and we're looking at the property, you know, there right next to the museum, next to the Ciudadelo, across from there. Before that, it was the property of Adolfo Blay. And we've studied Adolfo Blay. His store was what is the museum now, was the Blay store. He had a mercantile store, which he closed in 1913 or 14. Anyway, during the revolution, he closed it. And the property was given to the city in the 1980s for the museum. And Tony has told us in different presentations he's given to the History Club that nothing was changed from 1915 until 1980, when they opened it up and, you know, remodeled it for the museum. How I wish I had been there to photograph that with the opening, when he opened those doors and we saw something that was just as it was left in like 1915. So anyway, it was Alberto Almada, but before that, it was the Blay's property. And the other thing, the Blay family came to Mexico after the Civil War in the United States. They were on the Confederate side and they didn't want to live in the United States after the Revolution. Now, she mentions a number of different houses, but not with information about them. Now, she mentions the Ciudadelo was 2 Almada families lived there. And see, the Almadas, when we're going to have a presentation later about the Almadas, and the great book, The Almadas of Álamos, takes us to 1867. But after 1867, the Almadas branched into many different areas. And so it's hard to track. But she said the Ciudadelo, which wasn't, you know, the old fort, was the property. 2 Almada families lived there. She mentions a house, and we've all heard the story. This poor family rented a house and the owners decided to do kind of a work on the walls or whatever. The owners weren't living there. And when they came back, the house was not done. And the family was nowhere to be found. But later they found out that this poor family had bought ranches and a house in Mexico City. And the only explanation was they found a treasure or silver either in the walls or underneath the house. Now that story has been told on many different things. It was told on the Ciudadelo. She tells it of a different house, which is over there on Comercio Street. And then she tells about the house. We've all heard the stories of the case of a young girl getting pregnant, and she was, you know, to preserve the honor of the family, she, was, I guess, killed by the family or whatever. She mentions a little bit about things like that. One was the case of incest, and it was just too much for the family to acknowledge or anything. And so she tells stories like that, but she doesn't really go into much detail. There's about 5 pages of the book, and you need to, go online sometime and read those last pages, and you all may identify with different parts of it. But I was kind of disappointed because our guidebook has a very thorough and knowledge of the history of, and her walking tour was much less anyway than in information than what we have. Well, that's the end of the presentation, and because I've wasted the first 15 minutes, it lasts a little longer, but thank you. Do you have any questions or comments? You can unmute and give any questions or comments that you may have. Pam, I can't hear you.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Right. Can you give us our faces back? We still have your screen.
I'm sorry that I did
Just
not.
flip it to the side.
Well, just a minute. I'm going to not pause the share. I'm going to end. I don't want a new share. Stop share. There we go.
Okay. Now, I was just thinking while you were talking about, pregnant girls who disappear, issues of incest that are too scandalous to deal with. I wanted to go back to those 3 Salido sisters.
Okay.
And their piano playing bachelor brother. Why should these women have never married?
That's a question. Yeah, that's a question that she doesn't answer, but go ahead.
Right. And this has been raised before. There've been other stories I've come across mentioning groups of unmarried upper class women. I think it was because there were not upper class men of the proper descent, inheritance, Spanish descent, associated with banking or commerce or ranching or mining. And so they simply could not marry because there were not appropriate males for them. Now, why the brother never married? Maybe for the same reason. He seems to have been someone who is very preoccupied with his honor. His father makes him play the piano for a visiting guest, and he's so angry that he never plays the piano again after he performs for his father. His honor was also very important to him. So we get some hints of the very strong mores of this class.
Oh, that's good. You put that so well. And I think it continues in many ways. A friend of mine once said, well, people, in the upper class, however you describe it, they don't get married by accident. I mean, all of the approvals that have to be given, they have to match them. And I think you've hit it right. If there were no men worthy of the Salido daughters, then they didn't marry. We also have, she mentions cases, and it's in other histories, of people who they had a man and a woman may have had some kind of a friendship for many years but never married.
Right.
And we have examples of that, and I think she mentions in this book one that they had this close friendship, and yet for one reason or another they never married. And of course then we also have examples that we've read about of where the young man passes away, they are engaged to be married, he gets an illness and passes away, and she never marries after that because, you know, what, for whatever reason.
For whatever reason, right?
And the
Right.
Like a
reasons
Jane-
are, it's interesting, but I think you hit it, that they had to marry within their class. And
Sounds like a
that's
Jane
where-
Austen novel.
Go ahead, Ellen.
It sounds like a Jane Austen novel.
No, in Jane Austen novels, the women, there's Cinderella stories where the women marry up usually, or else in the case of Emma, she marries up a little, but a man who is appropriate to her status. These are people who are not going to marry down. And it could be that this couple who were engaged but never married because they didn't have the financial resources to do it in the style which their class required. The gifts, the dinners, the wedding trip to San Francisco. Speaking of San Francisco, one thing which is a little confusing is that she leaves in 1918,
Yes.
but in 1913, I reread part of the book before we started the
Oh,
session.
great.
But in 1913, her family did send her off just 13 days before the Revolutionary armies hit Alamos. Her
Right.
family sent her off to a private school. I think it was in Oakland, California, somewhere in the Bay Area.
Right.
So she did spend some time getting this evidently very prestigeful education in the United States.
Right. Yeah, that was it. We're gonna, you know, the education aspect. I didn't put anything in about the schools in this little presentation because I'm going to use parts of this book. On January 6th, you know, I'm going to talk about education, schools, public and private, in Álamos and in Sonora. And so the things that she had about schools and from other sources, I'm going to use that at that time. So I didn't mention about her education in this. By the way, for those of you here, so we will not meet again until January the 6th. And January the 6th, Carol and I will be in Álamos. It will be, you know, a live meeting as well as Zoom. And we're working with Umberto to make sure that we get a microphone for our meetings so that we can hear. Katie's meeting, it was hard to hear, you know, his speeches. But anyway, we'll be working on that, and I hope that all of our January meetings, just to give you an idea of what's ahead. January 6th is education. January 13th, Father Carpenter will take us on a tour of the church, the Chapel La Campana, you know, over to La Balvanera, and I think on the monastery. And we'll all, yeah, on the 13th. And then on the 20th, we will have, that will be music. And Ramon will be in charge, but also Trina will be on the music of Mexico. And then the 27th, we have on the television program, The Desert Speaks, of which Stephanie interviewed back in 1990. And then February 3rd will be a field trip, what Stephanie will lead, just by car. It won't be a bus, but she'll take us to spots. We'll stop and talk about it and have a social time, maybe a lunch. So anyway, we got so many great things ahead. And
Great.
yeah, I just want you all to just have a wonderful Christmas. And I'm glad Ellen is back in her home where she belongs. And everyone else out there, you know, just happy to see you. I'm sorry we left you over because we were late starting, but
Well, thank you, Errol.
oh,
Thank you, Errol. I enjoyed this a lot.
I did too,
okay.
yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, it's always fun talking about Álamos and so everything. So anyway, goodbye to all of you. I'll go ahead and end the meeting, and I hope the next time I have a meeting here, I'll do a better job anyway in terms of the technology. Okay, goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Merry Christmas.